so to say, in order to analyze costs and benefits of this choice in the wider area. Now, we are proceeding with Ruslana Rachel Palatnik. Allow me to say a few words. She's a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics and Management at the Israel Valley College and the head of Sustainable Economic and Environmental Lab at the same college, as well as a senior research fellow at the Natural Resources and Environmental Research Center in the University of her research interests are climate change economics, environmental policy evaluation, energy and natural resource economics, and water management. And in 2015-16, she was a visiting researcher at the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics in the University of California at Berkeley, where she was analyzing the economic aspects of biofuels. Not to take more time from her presentation, I will stop here with what she achieved till now. Ruslana, please.
Thank you, Grigoris, for the kind words. Just to make sure that you see my first slide without the notes, right? Okay, perfect. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present at this prestigious event. Hope to be present in the next year's Sustainable Summit. I will address the economic impacts of exporting natural gas through the case study of Israel as a representative Mediterranean small open country. I will start with a few stylized facts about the Israeli energy sector. Basically, Israel is an energy island. We don't have any connection in terms of power transmission with neighbors or any other energy sources. Until 2004, all the primary energy sources were imported in Israel, and the energy bill was about 5% of the GDP. And the electricity power generation basically was a regulated vertical monopoly up until 2 years ago. And I would claim that in general, we have rather low environmental awareness in private and public sectors, maybe relative to the average in the EU. But we should keep in mind also that the solar water panels on rooftops for heating water are all over here since late 70s. So when the technologies are cost efficient, people are ready to adopt them. So this is just a background. And starting from this background, we can discuss the natural resources, energy resources in Israel. Basically, since the establishment of Israel in late 40s, there was a major government effort to find, to discover oil, gas, etc. Nothing was revealed, and the government gave up those efforts after establishing the laws that basically gave the major rights for private entrepreneurs if they face, if they actually discover natural resources. And nothing interesting was happening up until 1999 when a small field offshore Israel, here you can see, Yam Tethys it is called, was discovered. In parallel to that, there was an effort to connect and import natural gas from Egypt in early 2000, and those imports started in 2004. But with the upheaval of the 2011, basically the pipeline from Egypt was sabotaged and effectively brought imports to a halt. But by that time, there were two major discoveries of the Tamar field in 2009, and after that of Leviathan, this major field in 2010, which allowed Israel to connect to the domestic energy source. And we can see the major change that it drove in primary energy supply by fuel, where there was no natural gas at all until 2003. And we can see that now we reach about 40% of the total primary energy supply from natural gas, as it basically drove out coal, because mainly natural gas is used in power generation for now. So this is background. Now let's go to the economic impacts. So when the discoveries arrived a decade ago, they raised an ongoing and raging debate in Israel about the optimal policy approach to make the most of those reserves in a way which would be the most economical, morally acceptable, geostrategically prudent, and all the while feasible. The debate revolves mostly around the topic of the country's rights, either by taxation or by direct ownership, what should be the price of natural gas for the local users, how much of the total reserves we should preserve for domestic use and how much we should export, and what is the environmental impact of the discoveries. So focusing on the export, the question of how much gas to preserve and how much to export was discussed in several government committees. And based on the Tzemach committee recommendations, it was decided that about 500 BCM should be preserved for domestic use, and the rest of about 350 BCM should be exported. Up until recently, the export was on a very low scale. There are several agreements signed with the neighbors, and probably some of you heard about the EastMed project that should, when it is built, when the pipeline will be built, it should connect Leviathan, the major field, with Cyprus, and then connect to the European market. So this is under discussion, construction, etc. So I would briefly present 3 studies that we recently conducted with the colleagues around the issue of exporting natural gas. In this first study that I present, we compared alternative scenarios of extraction and exporting that are on the table of policymakers now, and we compared the basic scenario as of now in Israel that I presented before versus the intensive extraction and exporting scenario where we basically export as fast as we can everything that is there. And the alternative is a conservative scenario where no export at all is allowed and all the reserves are used for the domestic users. What we found is that if the income from taxes is generated in sovereign wealth fund and then transferred for the future generations, then in this case, the social welfare, intergenerational social welfare increases when the extraction and exporting is rapid rather than in the conservative or the basic scenario, which is basically lays within the theoretical framework and the weak sustainability rule of Hartwig that says if there is a depletable natural resource, but when we can compensate the future generations, not with the physical units of it, but with the monetary units, then we gain the sustainable growth. However, given that we have fast export, we can be under threat of another phenomenon, which is called the Dutch disease. We have several examples in the economic history, and rather recent economic history, where in the scenarios that occur in small countries with an important resource extraction sector like natural gas can become in Israel, where the large-scale expansion of this sector generates large export revenues that are exchanged in domestic currency. This demand appreciates the domestic currency, causing domestic goods to become more expensive comparing to the foreign goods. And consequently, the country's international competitiveness soars, hampering its other imports of other goods and services. And instead of giving a rise to the economy, we gain a decline in the economic growth. So we were investigating whether, even though there is no much export already in Israel, whether the rumors or expectations about future export already causes appreciation of Israeli shekel. We can see here that in 2009, just before the Tamar was discovered, the Israeli shekel exchange rate versus dollar was around 4 shekels per dollar, and in 2017 it declined, and now it stays at around 3.5 and even lower than that. So we investigated the impact of expectations through the event study methodology. We collected announcements made in newspapers, in online publications, around the news around the natural gas industry in Israel. And we investigated whether those news had impact, extra impact on the exchange rate, extra comparing to other effects that present in the day-to-day market of exchange of the currency. And we did find in different layers the impact of news and expectations around energy and natural gas extraction and exporting. I will not go through those detailed graphs, but in general, the results revealed that gas-related news do affect the exchange rate and appreciate already Israeli shekels. And so the final study that I will briefly go through is the one that we currently work on, where we basically ask whether the natural gas can be a bridge and an obstacle to the green growth or to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. We are aware of the Green Deal for Europe, and we basically ask what can be feasible in economic terms, Green Deal for Israel. So employing an energy macroeconomic model, linked modeling framework of message and macro. We investigated the future transition of Israeli energy and the economy in the baseline scenario versus alternative scenarios where we have a carbon tax or other policy driven changes to mitigate greenhouse gases. And what we see here in bars are the changes in GDP growth by scenarios. And in the line, we see is greenhouse gas emissions in corresponding scenarios. So gray is the baseline scenario, and green is the scenario with carbon tax, and blue is the scenario with both carbon tax and also policy goals such as 85% of renewable energy in power generation and 100% of electric vehicles on road by 2050. And we see that basically without much affecting the economy, we can reach a significant reduction in carbon emissions. And here too, we can check the role of natural gas. We see the energy mix in power generation in the baseline versus the alternative policy scenarios. And we see that, for example, under the tax scenario where we reach a significant reduction in emissions, we still have about 40% of natural gas in power generation by 2050. So to summarize briefly, all the discussions that we had by now, we can claim that welfare increases when extraction exports are quick, given that income to future generation is transferred through sovereign wealth fund. However, we should remember that Dutch disease is a real threat, and there are evidences for currency appreciation already in Israel. If managed right, natural gas can bridge towards a clean energy transition, reducing the costs to the system. But I must say, this is not something that I can claim that I investigated. We do have evidences of resource curse occurring in Israel. The threats of corruption in the political system are not proven yet, but it's a real threat. So, any questions?
Thank you, Ruslana. I think that it was a very constructive contribution because based upon the example and the case of Israel, Ruslana was able to provide all the different questions that may arise with respect to the economic impact and also the environmental impact of natural gas resources extraction. Actually dealing with extraction in the sea and ocean is a very curious, a very interesting question with respect to blue growth and blue economy, because there are the strongest questions and issues that may arise with respect to economic, social, or environmental sustainability. I would like now that we can proceed with a third contributor. Just allow me to say only that